Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day in a very principled fashion. I founded FFF some 31 years ago with the mission of presenting the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, of course. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we strive to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet, and also to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which we've now been publishing for some 31 years. I want to talk to you about the protests that are taking place in Cuba right now. The news media is reporting that there's been protests with large numbers of people against the conditions in Cuba. There's a lot of illness, of course, with the pandemic. There's poverty. People really are on the verge of starvation. They've been like that for many, many years, decades actually. And time has passed them by. I mean, the rest of the world has been, up until the last year or so, been experiencing rising levels of prosperity, at least in much parts of the world. But that's never happened in Cuba. It's been mired in poverty for decades, since at least 1959, when the communists took control. And of course, the authorities in Cuba immediately clamped down on the protests, rounded people up, put them in jail, doing all the things that we would expect a communist or totalitarian regime to do. Well, of course, the conservative news media over here in the United States is saying, oh, this is just a wonderful thing, that the protests are taking place against this communist regime. But there's a lot of hypocrisy taking place here, and that's really what I want to address is the hypocrisy on both the left and the right. You've got President Biden there saying, oh, we're standing with the Cuban people. We want to let them know that we sympathize with them in their clarion call for freedom. This is just pure nonsense. I mean, it's false nonsense is what it is. Biden no more stands for the Cuban people than the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA do. I mean, that's the whole point of this embargo that's been leveled against the Cuban people since around 1959. That the embargo, which is that the Cubans call it a blockade, it is a set of economic restrictions on the American people. It punishes Americans who dare to travel to Cuba and spend money there. So you've got this direct violation of the principles of economic liberty, private property, and freedom of travel. And the entire aim of this embargo is to inflict harm on the Cuban people. Now, in the last several years, the U.S. government, or decades really, the U.S. government has expanded its embargo to foreign countries. Tells them that if you trade with the Cubans, we're going to inflict sanctions on you, we're going to punish you. And again, the entire aim is to inflict death and suffering on the Cuban people. I mean, it's not the only time that sanctions have been used in this way. We know that they were used like that on Iraq, where the sanctions contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. I'm reminded of the infamous line by Madeleine Albright, the UN ambassador to the United Nations, when 60 Minutes asked her whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions were worth it. She said, well, it's a difficult issue, but yeah, it's worth it. I mean, how can the lives of little children ever be worth any political goal? I mean, isn't that what terrorism's about? And that's what they're trying to accomplish in Cuba. That's what they tried to accomplish ever since the embargo went into place, is to inflict death and suffering on the Cuban people so that they do exactly what they're doing now, protesting and, in the ideal sense, rising up and having a revolution where they oust the communist regime there and install another pro-U.S. dictatorship there. Well, let's review a little bit of history here. That the turning point in American foreign policy took place in 1898. That was the Spanish-American War. The U.S. told Cuba, we're going to come to your assistance. Cuba was fighting for its independence from the Spanish Empire, along with the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico and other colonies of Spain. They were fighting for their independence, and the U.S. says, well, we're going to come to your assistance. Well, it was just a lie. It was a flat-out lie, because as soon as Spain surrendered, the United States said, well, we got news for you. We now control you. We're stepping in the shoes of the Spanish Empire. And they did. I mean, they controlled Cuba. They had troops there for a long time. They had their puppet president, their puppet legislature. That's how the U.S. ends up with its military, well, now a torture and prison camp at Guantanamo Bay. It was just through duress of forcing the ruler there to accede to this ridiculous lease, which is like a perpetual lease, which is totally illegal at some nominal amount. And that's how we get this imperialist base, which is what it is. It's part of the American empire of bases over there. And then after that, the U.S. just controlled Cuba through a series of puppet presidencies, all the way up through 1959 with Fulgencio Batista. And Batista was about as crooked a corrupt dictator you'd ever find. I mean, brutal dictator. He had gotten in bed with the mafia, which was the world's premier criminal organization. He had granted him licenses to run the casinos there in Cuba, in Havana. And let me give you an example of the brutality of this man. That he had struck a deal with the mafia where they were paying him a cut of the proceeds under the table, but he would have his goons go out in the countryside, in the small villages in Cuba, and kidnap young girls, minors, and then bring them over to the casinos, turn them over to the casino owners, who would then offer them as perks to the high rollers in the casinos. So it was just rape in a statutory sense. And that's what precipitated the Cuban Revolution, as a matter of fact. The lady who started the revolution, her name was Sanchez. I forget her first name. But she had a good friend who was a minor that was raped in this fashion. And she was so angry and outraged that she started the Cuban Revolution. And people started galvanizing to her, including Castro, Fidel Castro and his brother, of course. And so that's what started the Cuban Revolution. So they oust this crooked, corrupt, no good or rotten dictator who empties the coffers of the state before he leaves. But the U.S. loved this guy. The Pentagon loved him. The CIA loved him. I mean, they thought he was awesome because, you see, he was pro-U.S. So when Castro takes over, Castro's had committed two cardinal sins in the eyes of the national security establishment. One is he declared his independence, said, you don't control Cuba anymore. Well, that was a super no-no because the U.S. was accustomed to controlling Cuba. In their eyes, they had a right to continue controlling Cuba. And then secondly, as a direct result of the hostility here that developed because of that Declaration of Independence, Castro turns to the Soviet Union, which then converted him into a threat to national security. That's where the invasion at the Bay of Pigs. I mean, the invasion was just out aggression. I mean, Castro was right about that. The U.S. had no right to invade Cuba. Cuba had never done anything against the United States, certainly no criminal offense. But the U.S. took this position that they had the authority to invade because it was a communist regime. Well, where in the Constitution does it give them that authority? And well, the Supreme Court wouldn't enforce any constitutional prohibition against that sort of thing because by this time, the national security establishment has become the predominant force within the federal government. So that's when the assassination attempts started on Castro. And again, where is the power of assassination in the Constitution? Doesn't exist. But the power to initiate coups, like they had done in Iran in '53, where they destroyed Iran's democratic experiment. And that was when the CIA ousted Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected prime minister, and put in this brutal unelected dictator called the Shah of Iran. Then you've got the regime change operation in Guatemala the very next year, where they targeted people with assassination. Again, Guatemala had never done anything to the United States, but the Guatemalan president had made it clear, Jacobo Arbenz, that he didn't want to have anything to do with the Cold War that the U.S. was waging against the Soviet Union. And he said, I want to make friends with the Soviet Union. And so they went after him. They didn't kill him. He got out of the country in time, but they ousted him in a regime change operation. And so they felt they had the same authority to do so with Cuba. It was this hubris that they figured they were going to do it. And that's where they set up John Kennedy. They told him that the operation would succeed without air support. It was a lie. They just knew that once the invading forces were getting defeated by the communists, Kennedy would have to provide that air support because he wouldn't want to be embarrassed or humiliated that the communists had defeated these U.S. supported forces. Well, Kennedy didn't fall for it, and so it failed. This invasion failed at the Bay of Pigs. But this is the mindset, you see, that they have the authority to go in there and change things in Cuba through force or through this embargo. And it's always the pawns in this are the Cuban people. So when Joe Biden says we're standing with the Cuban people on this is pure nonsense. He's standing with the Pentagon. He's standing with the CIA that have never gotten over the fact that Castro's communist forces defeated their little army of Cuban exiles there at the Bay of Pigs, and then secured a deal in the Cuban Missile Crisis that Kennedy would not invade Cuba, which dashed their hopes. I mean, they were convinced, the Pentagon and the CIA were convinced that if Cuba remained under communist control, the United States couldn't stand. That this was like a dagger pointed at America's neck, and that something needed to be done to get rid of this communist regime. Well, Kennedy's position was the exact opposite. And that was his famous peace speech at American University, where he said, Cold War is over. And we're going to reach out to the Soviet Union and a feeling of mutual coexistence and harmony. The same thing, essentially, that Arbenz had done a few years before in Guatemala. And, of course, that's where Kennedy threw the gauntlet down at the national security establishment. But they've never given up their hope of getting rid of this communist regime and installing another Batista in power. That's their goal. I mean, that's their goal in Iran. That's their goal in any country. In Syria, where they're targeting for a regime change. North Korea, put in a pro-U.S. dictator there, and they don't care how the dictator behaves. I mean, he can brutalize his own people. We saw that in Iran with the Shah. They actually helped him. The CIA helped the Shah form the Sabak, which was a combination national police force that consisted of the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI all put into one. And they don't see any problems with this as long as the dictator's pro-U.S. You can see it in Egypt right now. You've got this brutal military dictatorship. Pentagon thinks it's great. It's great. I mean, because they're pro-U.S. Or Saudi Arabia, same thing. They're pro-U.S. That's all that matters. And the fact that they're brutalizing their own people, especially with armaments, weaponry that the U.S. ships them, doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. I mean, that's the quid pro quo. You can control the inside of your country. We don't care what you do, but we just need you to be pro-U.S. on the international arena. And that's what this embargo is all about, to squeeze the Cuban people into finally revolting or making things so bad that the military takes over and says, okay, we will bend the knee and put in a pro-U.S. dictator. I mean, this has always been the case with regime change operations. If you look at Argentina, for example, which took place about 10 years after the Kennedy assassination, I don't mean Argentina, I mean Chile, that took place 10 years after the Kennedy assassination, the question was the same. First of all, do everything you can to squeeze the Chilean people. That was President Nixon's orders to the CIA. His words were, make the economy scream. And the idea was, make it as miserable as you can economically for the Chilean people, even if it causes them starvation, which was part of their objective. The CIA started paying truckers to go on strike and subsidizing their pay so that they wouldn't be losing any money during the course of the strike. And this was all done secretly. Well, it was a national trucker strike, and the idea is to deny the Chilean people food so that when they're starving to death, it'll pave the grounds for a military coup, that they'll not only welcome a coup, they'll be demanding a coup. But again, you see the pawns in this are the poor people. Squeeze them, squeeze them, squeeze them, like in Iraq. You squeeze them by killing their children. And finally, they'll buckle. Well, all too often, they don't buckle. I mean, the dictatorship's too strong. The Castro regime, the Castros are not in charge anymore, but the communist regime in Cuba is very strong. They round up those people immediately that are protesting. But that doesn't matter. You see, these are pawns that the U.S. will continue its embargo with the idea now that they're smelling blood. Now they're saying, "Oh, wow, man, there's miserable conditions and there's generating these protests. Let's make it even more miserable for the Cuban people." And so you can be darn sure that they're going to be ramping up, anything they can to squeeze these Cuban people as well. And the other pawns in this are the American people. But ironically, a lot of Americans don't realize. They cheer about this embargo. They think it's wonderful, especially the conservatives. They don't understand that what's happening in this country is no different in principle from what's happening in Cuba. I mean, what really is the core issue in socialism? Well, it's government ownership or control over the means of production or the results of production. The government in Cuba is really the manifestation of the leftist dream, taking money from the rich and giving to the poor. That's the way it started out. You had these mansions of wealthy people that had been making money, the casinos and so forth. So, let's steal all those and nationalize them and give them to the poor. That's all fun and games for a year or so, but then who's producing anything? Oh, they took over all the industries, they nationalized the industries, again with this idea, the leftist dream of equalizing wealth, that we want everybody to be equal. Well, at the end of this journey, everybody's equally poor. It's like everybody's bankrupt. And I went to Cuba many years ago. I traveled to Cuba. I got a license from the Treasury Department to go over there to investigate socialism. I told them who I was and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. So they granted me a research visa or whatever license. And then I got a journalist visa from the Cuban people, the Cuban authorities. I didn't want to go over there as a tourist. I wanted to actually interview people, and I wanted to do it officially. I didn't want to get rounded up. And so I got a journalist visa. And, the Cuban people were among the nicest people I've ever met in my life. I mean, it was just amazing. They're just different in terms of their sheer niceness, genuineness. And I even asked a person there, I said, "Why are you so nice to me after what my government's done with the embargo?" And he says, "Oh, well, what responsibility do you have for your embargo?" Well, it's an interesting point that you see he was distinguishing between the government and the citizenry. But my position is that if a citizen supports the embargo, he's responsible for the implications of the deaths and the suffering, that he's just as responsible as the people that are engaged in this banality of evil, the bureaucrats that are enforcing these things and so forth. So my experience was the people in Cuba are verging on starvation. I mean, they're very proud. They would never beg. They would never ask for help, but they would couch things like, "Hey, if you have any medicines that you don't need before you leave Cuba, would you please leave them in your hotel room?" There was always ways to help without making it appear demeaning to people. But there was no doubt that the whole country's on the verge of starvation constantly. And part of this is the embargo. Now, part of it's the socialism, too. There's no question. So when U.S. officials say, "Oh, well, see, it's your socialist system," they're right. I mean, there's no question about it. The left won't say that because the left loves socialism. What the left says is exactly what the communist regime there says. "Oh, no, it's the embargo that's causing the problems. If you'll just lift the embargo and let us bring in our medicines, we can treat the pandemic, the vaccines, and everything. But you're causing this untold suffering with economics and now this healthcare crisis." And they're right. The fact is they're both right, the left and the right, that the socialist system is a fiasco and the embargo is a horror story. So the people it's like a vice. And so the people in the middle of this vice are the Cuban people. And on one side of the vice is the embargo, and the other side of the vice is their socialist system. And both sides are tightening the vice. And being squeezed to death are the Cuban people in the middle of this thing. And in the process, here in the United States, they destroy our right of economic liberty. I mean, look, the control that's demonstrated under a socialist system is no different from the control that is being demonstrated by the embargo. The control is actually on the American people. That's what people don't realize. They see it as a control on the Cuban people. No, if you travel to Cuba and you spend money there without this license that I got, you will be prosecuted here in the United States. You will be convicted, be put in a federal penitentiary for spending money. Now, people think it's illegal to travel to Cuba. It's really not. They want to create that appearance so that people don't do it. But you see that they took this position early on that freedom of travel is a fundamental right. They didn't want to appear like hypocrites by destroying this freedom of travel. I mean, and freedom of travel is a fundamental God-given human right that has always been recognized, that no government can interfere with this basic fundamental right. You have a right to travel wherever you want to travel. So what they did instead was, okay, well, you cannot spend money without our permission, which is just as bad, because the right to spend money is just as sacred as freedom of religion and freedom of travel and freedom of trade and freedom to protest or whatever. So when the Cuban authorities are rounding up these protesters, the authorities over here are putting people in jail for spending money in an unapproved way. Well, the principle of government control over how you spend your money here is no different from the socialist principle that exists in Cuba. Now, the Biden says, "Oh, well, we're so concerned about these poor people in Cuba." This is so ridiculous. I mean, if he's so concerned about poor people in Cuba, how come he keeps enforcing these immigration controls? Now, people keep saying, "Oh, open borders with Biden." It's ludicrous. Open borders is a dismantling of the entire immigration control system. It is like the situation we have here in the United States, where people can cross state lines freely. And that's what the case should be on the international border. Just people crossing back and forth. They don't have to change their citizenship. They can come over here to work, invest, visit, tour, whatever. And no one would even know who was a foreign citizen or not, any more than anybody knows today who's a foreign citizen. But so Biden has continued to enforce these controls. Okay, he may have changed some policies on refugees and stuff, but he still has that wall down there, that Berlin Wall. He still has the deportations. He still has the whole immigration control system. I mean, remember, when he was vice president, his president Obama was called a deporter-in-chief. So I'm always fascinated by these leftists who say, "Oh, we love the poor, we love the needy and the disadvantaged," and which they justify with their welfare state with, when it's their disdain for the poor, whether in Cuba or on the border, is demonstrated by their actual actions. Their embargo against the poor in Cuba, and their enforcement of immigration controls against poor people on the border who just want to come in and work. Now, let me say something about the welfare state, because there's a lot of hypocrisy here too. That when we've got this welfare state here that the left says, "Oh, this is freedom, Jacob. This is freedom," and of course the right supports it too now. And unfortunately, many reform-oriented conservative libertarians support it in terms of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and things like that, farm subsidies. I mean, you find that conservative-leaning libertarians supporting this stuff, along with foreign aid, which is a welfare state policy as well. Well, they have all these things in Cuba too. That's the real irony. They have Social Security, they have Medicare, they have Medicaid, they have government controls, they have income taxation, they have all the things, the Federal Reserve, they have all these things that Americans consider as free. I mean, in a sense, Cubans are freer than Americans because they understand that their system is a socialist system. Americans here consider their welfare state, warfare state, managed economy to be a free enterprise country, which is really ironic. It brings to mind the German thinker Johann Goethe, who said, None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And I don't think you'd find a better example of that than here in the United States. You got Americans singing, "Thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free." And they really believe it. And of course, that's one of the things that really distinguish us libertarians from non-libertarians. We've broken through the indoctrination, the decades of indoctrination, especially in the public school system, about how free we are. And of course, that always befuddles non-libertarians when they say, "What are you libertarians all about?" And we say, "Well, we're trying to, get a free society here in America." "What are you talking about? We're already free." Boy, you libertarians are really strange. They don't get it because their minds are encased in this thickness of indoctrination that surrounds their mind. And let's talk about Guantanamo Bay, because there's a lot of hypocrisy there too. Well, first of all, let me talk about the hypocrisy from the right. The right talks about free enterprise and private property and limited government, free markets, and so forth. The embargo is a direct violation of all those principles, but they love the embargo. They don't care if it's a violation of those principles. They'll just keep mouthing their little free enterprise mantras in their speeches and their websites and put it on their stationery and so forth. Free enterprise, private property, limited government. That's the popular conservative mantra. It's been there since the 1950s when Ronald Reagan was giving his General Electric talks. I mean, they love it. But when you take things like immigration controls, which conservatives love, direct violation of free market principles, and the embargo. It'd be difficult to find a better example than a violation of free market principles than the embargo, but conservatives love it. Another thing they love, along with the left, is the torture and prison center at Guantanamo Bay. And so I think it's worth talking about that, because when these people talk about the tyranny of the communist regime there in Cuba, it's really a tyranny that's mirrored there at Guantanamo Bay. In fact, it's really appropriate that the Pentagon and the CIA put this torture and prison center in Cuba instead of the United States, because their system there mirrors that of the communist regime in Cuba. And in fact, the reason the Pentagon and the CIA decided after the 9/11 attacks to put their torture and prison center in Cuba was they wanted it to be a Constitution-free zone and a Supreme Court-free zone. That was their objective. And they made no bones about it. They take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. We all know that. But it's a charade, because they hate it. If they believed in it, they liked it, they wouldn't try to establish a Constitution-free zone. They would say, even if they win and establish this zone in some foreign countries, they would say, well, we love our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. We're going to have those principles apply here. But no, it was the exact opposite. They said, we don't want the Constitution to apply here. They as all conservatives, they look at the Bill of Rights, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments as constitutional technicalities to let guilty people go free. So their original objective was no attorneys, no right to confront witnesses, and the Supreme Court put the quietus to the no attorneys business. But as far as the rest of the stuff, the military and the CIA have shown their supremacy within the federal court system, because you've got people there. One guy's in there for 19 years with not any charges filed against him. He's just there. I mean, the Bill of Rights specifically says that no person shall be deprived of a speedy trial. I guarantee you, 19 years is not speedy. And trial by jury, that's guaranteed by the Bill of Rights as well, but not at Guantanamo. They have military tribunals if and when they even have a trial, which is going to be a kangaroo trial. It's going to be no different from the trial in Cuba. I mean, those are kangaroo proceedings. If any of those protesters are brought to trial, then we all know what the verdict's going to be. We all already know what the verdict's going to be in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay part of Cuba. So they don't have a right to confront witnesses on either side, the Guantanamo Bay side or the communist side. In other words, their systems mirror each other. And so that's where the more of this hypocrisy comes in, that they've put together a system there in Cuba. U.S. officials have, the Pentagon and the CIA. And of course, the other three branches defer to them. The Supreme Court and the Congress and the President defer to them. the system they put into place mirrors that of the communist regime. Hearsay evidence is admitted when they have a trial. Military tribunals, really no effective assistance of counsel because they monitor communications between attorney and client there secretly. And they've got no right to confront witnesses, and they can torture people, just like they do in Havana. When some of these protesters are taken into custody, they might well be tortured, just like at Guantanamo Bay. And if a person confesses, then that confession is admissible in the proceeding. Or if they need a witness to bring up incriminating evidence to make sure they get a conviction, or make it look like the kangaroo proceeding is getting a conviction, they just torture the witness into saying what they want him to say. This is on both sides, the U.S. side of Cuba and the communist side of Cuba. So what we really need to do is do a lot of soul searching in this country, and start looking not so much at these foreign regimes and their tyranny, but looking inward, looking at ourselves. Biden needs to remember that when he's pointing a finger there at the communist authorities in Cuba, there's three fingers pointing back here toward the United States. We need to lift that embargo and leave Cuba alone. Leave it as an independent country. It's not going to come over and take over the United States. All that Cold War hype was it was a lie. It was a racket. Kennedy recognized it was a racket. We all know what happened to him. And we need to get rid of that imperialist base. Just abandon the base, just like they're doing at Bagram in Afghanistan. Walk away. Leave it to the Cubans. That's Cuban land. It's not U.S. land. It's not Pentagon land. It's not CIA land. It belongs to Cuba. Just walk out, abandon it, leave Cuba alone, and restore economic liberty to our land. Get rid of the whole socialist welfare state here and all the mandatory charity programs, along with this tyrannical IRS and income tax, which exists in Cuba as well. In other words, restore the good, positive founding principles of economic liberty on which our country was founded. That's this week's Libertarian Angle. Thanks for tuning in. Again, subscribe to our FFF Daily, which is free. Subscribe to our FFF Journal. If you like our work, give us a hand financially. Right now we're raising money to have a great civil liberties conference in the fall, and we'll be bringing you more information about that, but we could use a hand on that. So thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to talking to you all next week.